Chairman Justice Shah, Justice Chauhan, Justice Gupta, Dr. Swami, and my senior colleague, Mr. Raju Ramachandran, and all Mrs. Swami, and all members of the audience. You know, a story comes to mind when the Emperor Akbar, the third Mughal emperor, has a discussion with Birbal, his minister, his favorite minister, and the issue is really, who is greater, God or an emperor? So Birbal says, thinks about it and says, according to me, an emperor is much greater than God. At this point, Akbar is, of course, partly pleased but displeased because he thinks this is ridiculous. He's a God-fearing man. He founded a religion of his own. And he's concerned about why Birbal is making this bizarre statement. So he says, Birbal, I want an answer. If you don't give me a logical answer, I'll have your head. So the next day, Birbal comes back and says, the answer is very simple. You are a sovereign in your domain. If you cast somebody out from your domain, he is completely cast out of your domain. But God does not have that opportunity. Everybody is in the Almighty's domain. The time, friends, of emperors is gone. The time for sovereigns is gone. We are living with laws which were introduced in a different era. There was 377A was one such law. Justice Shah's bench took a view on it. We carried it to the Supreme Court. Now it's under reconsideration. But the Indian Penal Code, which is a law for about 34 countries, a law that had a fascinating journey from India to Africa, Singapore, Malaysia. The IPC is the law in Malaysia today. It's amazing how our textbook, our standard textbook, Ratan Dal Dheeraj Lal, is sought in all these countries. And I've had the benefit, therefore, of actually settling an appeal or two for Malaysia because they said the law is the same and by and large, we do follow the Indian Supreme Court, Indian High Courts. But that law, in parts, and here I disagree with Dr. Swami, in parts I would say it needs reconsideration, not necessarily in the whole, because a lot of the provisions have stood the test of time. So far as sedition is concerned, a quote comes to mind, and Lord Denning, a great English jurist, said, and I quote, "The offense of seditious libel is now obsolete. It used to be defined as words intended to stir up violence, that is disorder, by promoting feelings, ill will, or hostility between different classes of His Majesty's subjects. But this definition was found to be too wide. It would restrict too much the full and free discussion of public affairs, so it has fallen into disuse for nearly 150 years ago." Well, that's about the time Section 124A came into India. And as we've been told by the speakers before me, it has a large, wide canvas, used extensively by our colonial rulers. We had leaders such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Annie Besant. There were so many of our leaders who suffered the rigors of this law. And for some peculiar reason, we have continued with it. In 2015, 47 cases were reported. 47 cases in 2014 and 30 cases of sedition in 2015. Historically, this law has had a place in the times of emperors and rulers. So we had the trial of Socrates. Socrates, as we all know, was one of the greatest thinkers of our time. He is a legend who we remember till date. All students of law remember. And he talked about reasoning things out. So he told the young men of Athens, you must reason, you must think. And what happened to him? He was tried for his revolutionary ideas. And in those revolutionary ideas, 361 of the 500 jurors found him guilty, and he was sentenced to drinking hemlock poison to die. A man before his time, a man whose ideas were immortal, a man who was considered threat to society. Today, can any one of us actually think of a man of Socrates' brilliance being a threat to any society? And what did he say? And I quote, "I would rather die having spoken after my manner than to speak in your manner and live," unquote. In the mid-1700s, we had the trial of John Peter Zenger, somewhere in 1730s, a man who wrote an article in the New York Weekly Journal, and he talked about a satire of governors and councils. It was then ruled by the British. He was kept in jail for 9 months, kept writing, pleaded his case, taking the defense that the right to liberty is the right of exposing and opposing arbitrary exercise of power, the right to speak and the right to write the truth. The jury did acquit him, but after 9 months in prison. You know, this law has an interesting history. It was not in the Code of 1860. There was a draft code. Clause 113 was the draft provision. But for some reason, in the 1860 code, it did not come in. And finally, in 1870, it was brought in because at that stage, our rulers felt that there were some sections of our society aimed at reviving the Mughal emperor, aimed at reviving rule of an emperor in India, a domestic emperor. And that is the reason in 1870 they brought it in. About the same time, you have the Viceroy, Lord Mayo, and Justice Norman who get killed, who get murdered, and suddenly there is a need to bring in this to curb dissent, to curtail the voices of Indians. Justice Shah has spoken about a number of decisions, so I'm not going to repeat those decisions because he has elaborated on them in detail. But what is important is that after this comes in, the first line of questioning happened when there were 4 decisions in quick succession, and the word disaffection, which is crucial, was questioned because we had 4 different interpretations, judicial interpretations, and so in 1898, you had a new section 124A. And after that, you had, of course, Mahatma Gandhi was tried, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad was tried, and much later, you had Sheikh Abdullah also who was tried. There was this entire debate between Majumdar's case, Sadashiv's case, which finally culminated when we had the amendments to the Constitution, and we then got Kedarnath Singh's case, which is really what holds the day. Justice Shah has told us about the 2 judgments that struck down and that led to the amendment. Tara Singh's case, Master Tara Singh, who asked for a Punjabi Suba, and the other judgment, of course. Now, today, a question comes in our mind. Is Kedarnath Singh right? There's a common cause judgment 2016 which says, yes, apply the principles of Kedarnath Singh and follow the safeguards, whatever those are. But to my mind, there is a need to consider, is a law which relates to sovereigns, does it have a place in a democratic society? Does it have a place in a republic? Are there not other provisions in the code, as pointed out by Dr. Swami, which can deal with dissent? You know, when I was young, there was a joke that used to go around in communist Russia. A man stands in front of the Kremlin and he's discussing with an American, and he tells the American, what's the difference between your country and mine? So the American says, very simple, I have the right of freedom of speech. So the American says, and the Russian says, but so do I. So the American says, look, I can stand in front of the White House and criticize the President of the United States of America and nobody will touch me. The Russian turns around and says, that's no problem. I can stand in front of the Kremlin and curse the President of the United States of America and nobody will question me. The freedom of speech did not exist in communist Russia. I don't know whether it does now, but it definitely did not exist in communist Russia. And therefore we see that irrespective of sovereigns, irrespective of governments. We've had this law being brought in and applied through the ages. Treason is an offense for which many people have been tried and questioned. In the absence of kings, in the absence of feudal societies, a legitimate question arises, do we need this any longer? I can only say this, that today we've changed the way we work. I am of the pre-internet generation, and today for us to contemplate the way young people communicate and the pace with which they communicate is something which is mind-boggling, and we are trying to come to terms with it. But this communication is a right of freedom of expression. This communication, this expression, today we don't rely upon the media. However high the TRPs may be, we don't necessarily rely on television to tell us what we believe is right or wrong, or what is the news, or what should be the news. And in such a situation, a legitimate question arises. Who will determine how voices will be spoken? Should the government determine it? And to what extent? But I must warn you of one thing, and here Dr. Swami and I differ. I happen to be on the other side in the defamation case, and we did win, perhaps with the skin of our teeth. But there is a test which needs to be applied, and the test is the right to speak your voice also a right to abuse people, and to what extent? And there's a fine line that needs to be drawn. And that line is something which needs to be considered when we look at an archaic, at a provision such as 124A, which I must say is a provision of a bygone era, an era which we would perhaps rather forget. So friends, I will conclude by requesting all of you, and I'm grateful to the Law Commission for doing this here, that we have young minds. You are the future. You are the thinkers of the future. We will do what we have to in our generation, but you are the people who are going to change opinions as they come. And therefore, it is for you to contemplate, you to deliberate, and you to get back with your ideas. I just want to leave a thought with you, and this is what Pandit Nehru said when he talked about sedition, and I quote, he said, "Take again section 124A of the code. Now, so far as I am concerned, that particular section is highly objectionable and obnoxious, and it should have no place both for practical and historical reasons, if you like, in any body of laws that we may pass. The sooner we get rid of it, the better. We might deal with that matter in other ways, in more limited ways, as every other country does. But that particular thing, as it is, should have no place, because all of us have had enough experience of it in a variety of ways, and apart from the logic of the situation, our urges are against it. I do not think myself that these changes that we bring about validate the thing to any large extent." With that, I thank you all.